You know, it's strange. Sometimes the most unsettling stories are the ones that start out totally normal. Like, you think you've got someone figured out and then bam.
Total curveball.
Yeah, exactly. So today we're diving into the life of John Wesley Ewell. And let me tell you, this guy's story is anything but straightforward.
Definitely not your average case.
No, not at all. We're talking about a man who went from seemingly average guy to, to a serial killer.
And what makes it even more complex is the fact that we have so many different sources to work with. Court records, news articles, even a clip from the Montel Williams show.
The Montel Williams show. Seriously?
Yeah, you heard that right.
Yeah.
It's all part of the puzzle.
Wow. Okay, so what's our mission with this deep dive? What are we hoping to uncover about John Wesley Ewell?
I think the real question here is what makes a seemingly ordinary person capable of such horrific acts? I mean, that's the big one, right?
Yeah, that's the core of it.
Yeah.
So let's start at the beginning with what we know about his early life. And to be honest, there's not a whole lot there.
Yeah.
It's like he was a ghost for a big chunk of his younger years.
Right, the early years are a bit of a black hole, but then things take a pretty dark turn.
Okay, so his rap sheet starts with robbery and burglary. Pretty standard stuff. But then it escalates.
Yeah, we see a much more violent incident involving a woman at an ATM.
Oh, man, that's scary. So he's already showing signs of aggression and a willingness to use force.
Right, and that's important because it sets the stage for his run-in with California's three strikes law.
The three strikes law.
Yeah, and for anyone listening who isn't familiar with it, it's basically a law that imposes a really harsh sentence for a third felony conviction.
Harsh how?
Think like 25 years to life, even if that third felony is nonviolent.
Wow, that's intense. So basically it's like 3 strikes and you're out, but with much higher stakes.
Yeah, exactly. The goal was to deter repeat offenders and try to keep communities safe.
Huh.
But it's been pretty controversial since it was implemented.
I can see how that would be controversial. I mean, some people might argue that it's too harsh, especially for nonviolent crimes.
Right. There are definitely valid arguments on both sides. Some people say it's crucial for public safety, while others argue that it leads to prison overcrowding and doesn't really address the underlying causes of crime.
Okay, so back to Ewell's. In 1995, he gets caught for check forgery. Not exactly a violent crime, but because of his past convictions, he's staring down the barrel of a potential life sentence.
Yeah, talk about a high-stakes situation. I mean, imagine facing that kind of penalty for something like check forgery.
It's heavy stuff. And that's where a plea deal comes into play, right?
Exactly. A plea deal is basically an agreement between the defendant and the prosecution where the defendant pleads guilty to a lesser charge or fewer charges in exchange for a lighter sentence.
So in Ewell's case, this plea deal spared him from a much longer prison term. Instead of a potential life sentence, he ends up serving 7 years. Gets out in the late 90s and then does something pretty unexpected. He becomes a hairdresser and a handyman.
Yeah, it seems like a total 180. Like he's genuinely trying to rebuild his life.
It's almost like he's trying to prove that he's not the same guy who committed those earlier crimes.
Right. And to make things even more interesting, he becomes an advocate against the very law that almost took away his freedom, the three strikes law.
He becomes an advocate
Yeah.
against the law that almost put him away for life. That's why, I mean, was he being genuine or was this some kind of calculated move?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Was he truly reformed and trying to prevent others from experiencing the same harshness he faced? Or was there something else going on beneath the surface?
It's hard to know for sure.
Right.
We can analyze his words, his actions, but we can never really get inside his head.
Right. And this is where things get even more complicated. Because just a few years after becoming an activist, Ewell commits a string of brutal murders. It's like a terrifying plot twist.
Oh, wow. Okay, hold on. Let's back up a bit before we dive into those murders. You mentioned that he even appeared on the Montel Williams show in 2006. What was the context of that appearance?
The episode was focused on the impact of the three strikes law, particularly on individuals convicted of nonviolent offenses.
So Ewell was brought on as a case study.
Exactly. He was there to share his story and talk about his fear of a life sentence.
It's almost surreal to imagine him sitting there speaking out against the system, knowing what he would later become.
Right. It makes you wonder about his true motivations. Was his activism genuine? Was it a calculated move to manipulate public perception? Or was it something in between?
It's hard to say. Maybe it was a mix of things. Maybe he did feel remorse for his past, but also saw an opportunity to protect himself by presenting himself as a reformed advocate.
It's definitely possible. I mean, remember, he was still under scrutiny for his past convictions. So by portraying himself as a changed man, he could potentially deflect some of that attention.
A strategic play to manage his public image. It's interesting, though, because he wasn't alone in his opposition to the three strikes law. There's a whole movement dedicated to reforming or even repealing it.
Absolutely. Critics argue that it's simply too harsh and that it doesn't allow for proper rehabilitation.
Yeah.
They point to cases like Ewell's as evidence that the law can be unjust and lead to excessive punishment.
But there are also people who strongly support the three strikes law, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Proponents argue that it's a necessary tool to keep repeat offenders off the streets and protect communities. They say it's about keeping people safe.
So it's a really complex issue with valid arguments on both sides. And it becomes even more complicated when you consider what you did later on. I mean, here's a man who experienced the harsh realities of the justice system firsthand, became an advocate for change, and yet ultimately succumbed to his own violent impulses.
It's a chilling reminder that human behavior can be incredibly complex and often contradictory.
Hmm.
Even with the limited information we have about Ewell's inner life, it's clear that there were deeply disturbing forces at play.
Forces that eventually led him to commit a series of horrific murders just a few years after his appearance on the Montel Williams show. It's a stark and unsettling contrast. So let's delve into those crimes and try to understand what might have triggered such a dark and violent turn.
Absolutely. In late 2010, Ewell embarks on a terrifying spree in Hawthorne, California, targeting 3 separate homes and preying on elderly and vulnerable individuals. His actions were calculated, brutal, and shockingly different from the persona he had presented to the world just a few years earlier.
It's a chilling thought,
Yeah.
and it raises so many questions. What happened to John Wesley Ewell? How did he go from advocating for a more just system to becoming a perpetrator of such horrific violence?
That's what we're going to try to unpack in this deep dive. We'll examine the evidence, explore the theories, and try to make sense of this complex and disturbing case.
Stay tuned, folks, because this is just the beginning of a very dark journey. Okay, so you've got this picture of you as this reformed activist speaking out against the system, but then he commits these brutal murders. It's a
Right.
jarring shift. Can you, walk us through what
This
happened?
is a really chilling turn of events.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in late 2010, he targets 3 different homes in Hawthorne, California. And his victims, they all fit this disturbing pattern: elderly and vulnerable individuals.
It doesn't sound like these were just random acts of violence. Was there, a method to his madness, so to speak?
Definitely. Let's take a look at his first victim, 80-year-old Hannah Morcos. He was found face down in his home, brutally beaten to death, and his hands were bound.
Oh, gosh, that's terrible. And then there's Denise Roberts, right?
Yes, Denise Roberts was 53 years old. She was also found in her home, bound, gagged, and strangled.
Ugh, it's just horrifying. And Ewell robbed both of their homes.
Exactly.
Well,
Robbery seems to have been at least part of the motive, and tragically, this pattern continued with his other victims.
you mean Lehman and Robin Turnage?
Yes, Lehman
Yep.
Turnage was 69. Robin was 57. They had just returned from a trip to Florida when Ewell entered their home. He bound them and strangled them both.
It's just so disturbing. And he stole jewelry from their home, too, right?
That's right. It seems like robbery was a consistent motive in all 3 cases.
Okay, so there's definitely a clear escalation in his violence compared to his earlier crimes. I mean, it's a huge jump from robbery and check forgery to murder. What do you make of that?
It's a really significant shift, and it raises a lot of questions. I mean, the level of brutality, the premeditation, the targeting of vulnerable individuals, it all points to this really dark turn in his criminal behavior.
Yeah, it's like something snapped, you know?
It's possible. I mean, there are a lot of potential factors that could have contributed to this escalation. His time in prison, exposure to violence, unresolved psychological issues. It's hard to say for sure.
I guess we can't really know what was going on in his head, but it's a terrifying thought that someone could change so drastically.
Absolutely. And it highlights the fact that we don't always fully understand the motivations behind these kinds of violent acts. Human behavior can be very complex.
So how did Ewell's reign of terror finally come to an end?
Well, it was actually a combination of carelessness and technology that led to his downfall. He was already under suspicion for the murders when he made a crucial mistake.
What did he do?
He tried to use Robin Turnage's ATM card without a mask. Security cameras caught clear images of his face, and, well, that was the break the police needed.
Wow, it seems almost too simple after such calculated crimes.
It does, doesn't it? But even the most meticulous criminals can make mistakes. And in Ewell's case, this seemingly small oversight sealed his fate. He was apprehended shortly after, and when they searched his car, they found something else that was pretty chilling.
You're talking about the newspaper article about another serial killer, right? Lonnie David Franklin Jr., the Grim Sleeper.
Yes, that's right.
Hmm.
It was a detail that added another layer of complexity to an already baffling case. I mean, what was Ewell doing with that article? Was he studying Franklin's methods? Was it some kind of twisted inspiration?
Yeah, it's a disturbing thought. It's like he was fascinated by another serial killer's crimes.
It's possible. Maybe he was seeking validation for his own dark impulses. Or maybe it was something even more sinister, a sign that he was learning from another killer's playbook.
Man, that's creepy. So what happened next? Was there a trial? Did he face justice for his crimes?
Yes, but the legal proceedings took a bit of an unexpected turn. He initially pleaded not guilty to all charges, but then in 2019 he accepted a plea deal.
Wait, a plea deal. Why would he do that if he was claiming innocence?
Well, the prosecution was seeking the death penalty. By accepting the plea deal, he avoided that outcome.
Ah, so it was a strategic move to save his own life. And what was the final sentence?
The court sentenced him to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole.
Wow, so basically he's going to spend the rest of his life behind bars.
That's right. It's a heavy sentence, but one that reflects the gravity of his crimes. The pain and suffering he inflicted on his victims and their families is immeasurable.
Yeah, it's a heartbreaking situation all around. We've talked about the cycle of violence, but are there any other psychological factors that experts have considered in trying to understand Ewell's descent into such horrific acts?
There are a few theories, but it's important to remember that we're dealing with speculation and limited information. One concept that some experts have pointed to is prisonization.
Prisonization. I've never heard of that. What does it mean?
It refers to the process by which individuals adapt to the prison environment and adopt its values and norms. It can have a really profound impact on someone's psyche. Sometimes it can lead to a heightened sense of aggression, distrust, and detachment from conventional society.
So it's possible that Ewell's time in prison, instead of rehabilitating him, actually made him more prone to violence.
It's a tough question to answer definitively, but it's definitely a possibility that can't be ignored. We also have to consider potential pre-existing conditions like antisocial personality disorder, which is characterized by a disregard for the rights of others and a lack of empathy.
So someone with that disorder might be more likely to commit violent crimes.
Potentially, yes.
Yes.
It's a complex issue, and there are many factors that can contribute to violent behavior.
I see. So even with the limited information we have about Ewell's early life, it's possible that there were red flags that went unnoticed or were dismissed.
It's definitely possible. It just highlights the complexity of understanding and predicting human behavior, especially when it comes to violence. There are often multiple factors at play, and it's rarely a simple equation.
That's a sobering thought. Knowing what we know now about Ewell's crimes and the possible psychological factors involved, it makes his activism against the three strikes law seem even more complex and paradoxical.
It really does. On one hand, you see a man advocating for a more just and humane criminal justice system, and on the other hand, you see a man capable of unspeakable acts of violence. It challenges our assumptions about redemption, the effectiveness of rehabilitation, and the very nature of good and evil.
It's a lot of process. Before we wrap up, I want to go back to that newspaper article about Lonnie David Franklin Jr. Do experts have any theories about why Ewell might have been so fixated on another serial killer?
There are a few possibilities. Some experts believe that individuals who commit violent crimes, especially serial killers, often seek out information about other criminals who have committed similar acts.
So it's like they're looking for a connection with someone who understands them.
It's possible. Maybe they're trying to find validation for their own actions, or maybe they're looking for ways to improve their craft, so to speak.
That's a scary thought.
It is. It suggests a level of detachment and a lack of empathy that is very disturbing.
So it's like they see themselves as part of this exclusive club of killers.
In some cases, yes. It seems that they view themselves as being set apart from the rest of society, bound by their shared capacity for violence.
It's a chilling reminder that there's a whole world of darkness out there that most of us will never fully comprehend, thankfully.
But it's important to try to understand as best we can the forces that drive individuals to commit these kinds of horrific acts. Only then can we hope to develop effective strategies for prevention and intervention.
Man, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. Ewell's early crimes, his transformation into an activist, and then his horrific descent back into violence. It's almost like we're dealing with two different people.
It really is one of the biggest questions surrounding this whole case. Was his activism genuine? Was it just a calculated facade? Or was it something in between?
Right, like a weird mix of remorse, self-preservation, and a desire to kind of make up for his past. I guess we may never really know the answer for sure.
Probably not. And that's what makes this case so fascinating. It forces us to confront this idea that good and evil can exist within the same person. which is a lot to wrap your head around.
It really is. It
Wow.
challenges so many of our assumptions about redemption, like the idea that people can change and the possibility of rehabilitation.
Absolutely. And it's especially unsettling because Ewell's story shows us that even people who advocate for justice can still harbor this deep-seated darkness.
Yeah, and it makes you think about the limitations of our current systems, too. Like the criminal justice system and the mental health system, are they really equipped to address the root causes of violence? Are they really doing enough to prevent these kinds of tragedies?
Those are big questions. And I don't think there are any easy answers. We've talked about a lot of potential contributing factors already, the cycle of violence, prisonization, possible personality disorders. But are there any other theories or insights that experts have offered to help us understand why Ewell turned to such brutality?
Well, one area that researchers have explored is the role of societal factors. Ewell lived in a community that was plagued by poverty, crime, and gang violence. And some experts believe that exposure to those conditions, especially during childhood, can increase a person's susceptibility to violence later on.
Right. So it's not just about individual psychology. It's also about the environment a person grows up in and the kind of pressures they face.
Yeah, like a toxic mix of personal vulnerabilities and these external stressors that can push someone over the edge. You know what I mean?
Exactly. And unfortunately, those societal factors often disproportionately impact marginalized communities. So you end up with this vicious cycle of poverty, violence, and incarceration.
It's like a system that's rigged against certain groups of people, and it makes it so much harder for them to break free from that cycle of violence.
It really does. And it highlights the need for systemic change. We can't just focus on individual rehabilitation. We need to address the underlying social and economic conditions that contribute to these problems in the first place.
It's a big challenge, but it feels like a necessary one. If we can learn anything from Ewell's story, it's that we need to do more to prevent these tragedies from happening in the first place.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
We need to shift our focus from punishment to prevention, from isolating people to reintegrating them back into society, from judgment to understanding.
It's a long and challenging journey for sure, but it's one we have to take if we want to create a safer and more just world.
I agree. We have to keep pushing for change, keep advocating for those who are most vulnerable, and keep believing that a better future is possible.
Well said. This deep dive into John Wesley Ewell's life has been both fascinating and really disturbing. It's definitely a story that I won't forget anytime soon. I mean, it's a reminder that there's darkness out there, but it also shows us the complexity of human nature and the need for compassion and understanding.
I think that's a really important point. We can't just write people off as monsters. We have to try to understand the forces that shape their lives, the choices they make, and the consequences of those choices.
Yeah, and I hope our listeners will walk away from this episode with a renewed sense of curiosity about the world and the people in it, maybe even a desire to get involved in some way, to work towards creating positive change in their own communities.
That would be amazing. I mean, even small acts of kindness and understanding can make a difference. It's about recognizing our shared humanity and working together to build a better future.
Well said. Thank you for joining me on this journey. And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has given you something to think about, perhaps even something to act on. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.